So, welcome everybody to the monthly AVH study group webinar where I'm pleased and honored to welcome back one of our favorites, AVH favorite, Dr. Joe Kellerstein, who's going to talk about the conception of vital force, which we were just talking about a little bit. And it's a huge topic that hopefully we'll be able to at least start to make a dent in over the next hour or so. So everyone know how to raise their hand and or ask questions. If you just click on the hand button on the top left of your control panel, then I'll be able to unmute you when Joe takes a pause. So, let me just open the control panel. I think we're recording. Yep, we're recording. So, do you want to take it away, Joe? And let's get started since you've got so much to talk about and we have so many questions, and let's get going.
Jeff, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's always such a joy to talk to the veterinary community. The contact that I've had with you guys, you are the best. You are the naturopaths that I wish all naturopaths were. You are fantastic homeopaths, and you are dedicated, and it's such a thrill to be with you guys whenever I'm there. Anyway, I feel such an affinity to that. It's been that way since the first time I had a chance to speak to you, and that too was thanks to Jeff. But tonight, please, Rodney Dangerfield was a guy who always felt no respect. I'm a guy who always feels alone. I need your participation, and I want you to talk to me. So this concept that tweaked me when Jeff and I had discussions about what might be salient for you sent me off on this wild goose chase across the internet, which feels as if it's across planets, across universes even, only to arrive back at where we are in the first place, but be in a different position. And I think people said that about Zen and Buddhism and various other concepts, but it's so true. So the idea of the vital force, it's always bothered me. I teach the organon. Let me just get that mail program out of here so it doesn't tweak us again. Good. Okay. So the idea of the vital force in homeopathy is so contentious, is fraught with so many questions that I thought it was important to start off by giving us some context, some history, some idea. When I first started to research this across the internet, the first response I got was, I got so angry. I was just looking up the vital force. To me, it was a concept that was normal to homeopathy and no big deal. Hahnemann posited an idea of an energy unique to life. Doesn't that make good common sense? That you look at a person, you look at a life, and you guys are so expert in so many different life forms as to put me to shame. Doesn't it make sense that there is a force unique to life? So when I hit the internet, the intellectualism and concepts I met were disconcerting, to say the least, perhaps even offensive, got the hair up on the back of my neck. But I wanted to introduce you to a little bit of this. So the idea tonight is homeopathy and the vital force. So jump into the pool. The water's fine. I want all of us to talk, flesh this out. There are no final answers, but there are some amazing ideas and surprises in the organon, which is our ultimate goal. And I don't know how long this is going to take. I just threw together some ideas, and I'm more than open to ideas, challenges, contradictions. Please, please, please. Because we must have a forum that is unique, open, egalitarian, and that guides us somewhere. So let's take a look at this. Let's look at where I began. This is just my track. This is the track through the internet wall of information. So the photo you see up there is of a very famous biologist, Ernst Mayer. Ernst Mayer was born the beginning of the century. He died at about 100 years of age. So he died in 2005. Very respected biologist. So when I first started Googling Vitalism, just to get a background, a historical background on this concept of the vital force, here's what I found. So there was an article online by Dr. Peter A. Lipson, MD, and here's a quote. Biology was one of the last of the natural philosophies to become a science. So here we see kind of a distinction between a philosophy and a science. It was clear to those who had studied chemistry and physics, and again, here I'm interpreting, my son is getting a PhD in physics, and so I know how they feel, and they're quite elitist, trust me, even more so than Sheldon on Big Bang Theory. It is clear to those who studied chemistry and physics that certain principles seemed to explain the natural world. I question that. I question that. Chemistry and physics can explain only the simplest of phenomena which occur in the real world. They're extraordinarily useful. Yes, but are they complete? Not as of yet, no. But those who study the living things, that's unfortunately us, we're at the bottom of the ladder here, the dregs. Those who studied living things were mostly involved in description. I guess we could also call that observation. Still, biology has become a science in its own right, I guess, despite the inherent failings of not being able to demonstrate universal law. According to Ernst Mayer, one of the greatest biologists of the last century, so here we have a justification by establishing someone else as an authority. A number of events preceded biology being recognized as legitimate science. Legitimate, a nice value-toned word. One vital event was the recognition that all biological processes, I want you to notice the word all in the sense of a vast generalization without exception. All biological processes were constrained by the laws of physics and chemistry. And at this point, I'm seeing an image of Jeff at somebody's bedside writing a ticket for failing to adhere to the laws of physics and chemistry. So,
thanks, Joe.
Anytime, Jeff. Another important step was the rejection of two erroneous principles. Vitalism, which is where we are, guys, and teleology. So what's teleology? Teleology, as I understand it, is the study of a phenomena with an idea as to its ultimate purpose. I'm going to stop there for a second. Here's Ernst Mayer. Here's a picture of Ernst. So the height of Ernst Mayer's career was his publication of several books, especially in and around 1950. I want you, if anybody is out there listening, I'd like your reaction to what we've looked at so far, because guys, we are all about vitalism and teleology, and therefore, according to this man, we are anti-scientific. So based on the fact that we treat philosophically with an eye towards a vital force, we can never be accepted as scientific. We will always be a mystical endeavor, and therefore necessarily rejected. What do you guys think? If I haven't upset you, I'm not doing my job.
So it's Susan Bale, and my question to that is, just like reading Hahnemann, you know, like sometimes you tear your hair out a little more than other times, but some of the contradictions in that depend on when in his life and his philosophical maturation he wrote. So I just wonder when in this guy's 100 years of life he wrote that, and was he talking about sort of hard physics versus quantum physics too?
All excellent questions. I too would tear my hair out, except I haven't got enough left to do that. But thank you, Susan. Anybody else?
I'm gonna only chime in because this is a big hot button for me that I repeat every day. And this statement and this reality, which is exactly as you said, what is going to prevent us from ever being accepted, this basically is why the modern medical scientific framework cannot explain why you're alive and why you're dead.
Damn right. Attaboy, Jeff.
I mean, that's fun. I mean, well, are you dead because your heart stopped? Well, what about the physiologic process? You know, what about the underlying cause for the physiologic function? No, it doesn't exist. So I'll be very interested to hear what you think about why that happened and why. I mean, I've got my own ideas about why vitalism was rejected in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
What are they, Jeff? What are your ideas?
Well, when we get to that, I will say, but let's go forward. Yeah.
You bet.
Anyone else? Let me just click over.
Because essentially he's saying, you guys are practicers of mysticism.
Yep.
You are throwbacks. You are throwing biology back into the realm of mysticism.
What's wrong with mysticism as a practice, though?
You know what? I think it's terrific because, quite honestly, I would rather be legally governed by the boundaries of mysticism.
Likewise. Well, and then there's a sort of there's that moral and ethical governing that we impose upon ourselves too, that sometimes is by the boundaries of mysticism or lack of boundaries of mysticism.
I so agree. I so agree. But this is the first thing I hit. And not only that, I was going to put the rest of Dr. Lipson's article on here, but he was in fact, I may be misrepresenting him, but my impression was there was an element of disgust or distaste that certain presumptuous endeavors, like holistic medicine, had the gall to re-inject vitalism into biology. And of course, he talked about homeopathy as a science that said, well, if you shake a remedy just right, it could affect your vital force. So, you know, that for me raises another incredible anger. Let me be non-professional or a-professional, whatever the word is, unprofessional, in saying that I hate it when I see somebody publicly displaying their ignorance of homeopathy, that they're entirely, clearly, homeopathically illiterate, but see no problem in putting it down. Anyway, let's go on. So this was Ernst Mayer, one of the great biologists of this past century. Let's move on just a tad. So now we're going to move on from this orthodox view of biology that rejects vitalism and teleology to right here. Here's my however. And this from a wonderful website called starlarvae.org with a lot of very forward-thinking intellectuals on it. Listen to this. The new science of complexity or complex systems theory retrieves the discarded doctrine of vitalism. Now, before we go on, is everybody okay with the idea of systems theory? What is it? What's the big unique thing about systems theory? Can anybody answer that? Jeff, anybody coming through?
Nope, no hands, no replies.
So let me just do a little bit. Anybody is totally welcome to jump in later on. So the idea in systems theory is that many complex systems, not just biological, can create a system. So what is it about a system? Let's take a really good example for me, because I have a love-hate relationship with my Mac, with this computer. Jeff happens to be an expert. I am just a frustrated novice. But the idea here is this: a system, like a computer, is put together with a whole bunch of parts. But if you put all the parts together in just a certain way, they become greater than the sum of their parts. Isn't that odd? So, for example, if I get my Mac and I plug it in, and assuming everything is just so in the operating system and in the machine itself, and I plug it in, I then hit the power button, the machine turns on, and lo and behold, I get a responsive screen. Wow. That can take me into unknown, uncharted realms of the internet galaxy. So, all these nuts and bolts and plugs, if you put them together in just the right way, can create a living, responsive screen. Almost living, of course, I'm exaggerating. This is called an emergent property of the system. A property that might not be easily predictable, and is certainly different than the simple sum of the nuts and bolts and computer keyboard and plugs of the machine. The emergent property, the new property that is far beyond anything you might have predicted from the sum of the parts, is this living interactive screen. So one of the functions of a complex system is the creation of an emergent property, such as one of the functions of an organic whole is to create a life, a consciousness. Another property of complex systems, even non-organic, is the ability to self-correct. A computer can check to see if viruses are there or what's wrong with its own system. So self-repair is a property of complex systems. So in a very real way, we could look at the complex system of a biological entity like our patients, whether it's a human in my realm or one of many different species in your realm, and to say, what signals is the system giving us of disorder or discontent that we might then use to remedy an issue? This is one of the properties of complex systems. Now, complexity has become one of the latest and the greatest of scientific endeavors, the study of complex systems. And here's what this gentleman on the internet said, just as a counterpoint to Mayer and this doctor who was so disgustingly looking upon alternative medicine. So he says, the new science of complexity or complex system theory retrieves the discarded doctrine of vitalism. Wow! Complexity theory assigns to nature a capacity to self-organize. Self-organization is one of the properties of any complex system. To construct complex structures and process spontaneously. Oh. One arrangement of atoms constitutes a living cell. Another arrangement constitutes a formerly living cell. The arrangement of atoms seems to make an important difference, but attributing the difference to difference in information bumps the explanation back a step to the question, what is it about information that makes the difference? Invoking information is a stealth maneuver by science to retrieve vitalism without admitting the deed. So what he's saying here is, although vitalism is completely unacceptable in modern science, it's a throwback, complex systems theory is the future. But instead of invoking vitalism, we use the word information. That differences in information make all the difference. So really, we're simply avoiding the issue. I love it. So at the height of the middle of the last century, Ernst Mayer and his influence said vitalism and teleology are clearly false. But you'll see in a moment that they really did so without any proof. It was a political kind of exhortation rather than anything factual. And it served to make vitalism totally rejected and persona non grata in the field of discourse. But now it's being reintroduced, but with a new set of clothes. And it's called complexity theory, and it's all the rage. Here's a picture of René Descartes that I just introduced because I never liked his face. But what the heck? He's a brilliant, brilliant man. And let's go back into the history of vitalist positions. So although vitalistic positions date back to antiquity, and in fact, yes, I found many references to vitalism that go all the way back to ancient Egypt, certainly to ancient Greece, certainly to Hippocrates and his corpus. But although vitalistic positions date back to antiquity, some scholars believe that to understand the more modern impulse, we should begin by the ideas expressed by Descartes. Descartes maintained that animals and the human body are automata, mechanical devices, machines, differing from artificial devices only in level or degree of complexity. So the human body is no different than a clock. The only difference is how complex it is. This is Descartes. Now remember, Descartes posited his philosophy in an era beset by the Inquisition. He was personally scared to death to tread on any area offensive to the Inquisition. So what he did was he would say the human soul, that organ of meaning, is really bequeathed by God, and that is the realm of the church. Anything material, however, could be the realm of time and position and measurement, and therefore the realm of science. And he said anything other than the realm of God is the realm of mechanism. He did this partly out of belief, but to an unknown degree, to avoid persecution by the Inquisition, he let the church have its realm if only he could have his. So he said, all bodies are automata, mechanical devices, just like any machine, differing only in the degree of complexity. Vitalism developed as a contrast to this mechanistic view over the next several centuries, with several figures opposed to the extension of Cartesian mechanism to biology, arguing that matter could not explain movement, perception, development, and certainly not life. So the idea of vitalism really sprang into the foreground after Descartes as a reaction to what was seemed an oppressive viewpoint. Vitalism, even into the 20th century, had many notable protagonists. So the most notable is this gentleman whose picture you see here at the bottom of the page. His name is Hans Driesch, 1867 to 1941. So you see here that 1867, he is after Hahnemann's death in 1843. But he was like the epitome, he was amongst the epitome of the German Romantic period. He was an embryologist. And he explained life, the life of an organism, in terms of the presence of this word entelechy. Entelechy being a force, an invisible force, a substantial entity controlling organic processes. So for Aristotle too had this general concept. I don't know if Aristotle referred to it as an entelechy, although I've read books that said that it came first from Aristotle and not from Driesch. So I don't know who's true. But the idea of entelechy is it's a driving force, very teleologic in its orientation, meaning if you look at an embryo, and all of us who have been very begrudgingly studying embryology in our first biology classes, realize if you just reflect on it quickly, it is such a gorgeous manifestation of a kind of vital force. You have one cell, or just the two gametes, creating a vector of development that is absolutely astounding. So is it any wonder that those people entranced with the study of embryology would become vitalists, right? Hans Driesch. This whole German Romantic period that actually started with the era of Hahnemann, became highly ensconced in the idea of vitality, of things involved in an organic model. Okay. So the French philosopher Bergson, 1874, again well after Hahnemann, posited an élan vital, a vital spirit, to overcome the resistance of inert matter in the formation of living bodies. Excuse me. To go back, and I wanted to highlight that most of what I'm about to use came from this monograph, Romanticism, Vitalism, and Medicine by Sebastian Normandin. Okay? Vitalism now has no credibility. This is sometimes credited to the view that vitalism posits an unknowable factor in explaining life. And further, vitalism is viewed as unfalsifiable. You'll remember, falsifiability is the cornerstone of science. And therefore, because it is not falsifiable, it is unknowable, it becomes a pernicious metaphysical doctrine. You can see why, if that were true, vitalism would be rejected. You can't question it, you can't test it. So you can only take it as an article of faith. If it's faith, it can't be science. Ernst Mayer, there he is again, says that vitalism virtually leaves the realm of science by falling back on an unknown and presumably unknowable factor. Hempel, by contrast, insists the fault with vitalism is not that it posits entities that can't be observed, but that such explanation renders all statements and about entelechies inaccessible to the empirical test and thus devoid of meaning. Because no methods of test, however indirect, are provided. The central problem is that vitalism offers no prediction, no tests of validity. But here, the author of this study says, really, neither complaint has a lot of historical credibility. So my next question to you guys is that how you feel about homeopathy? If the major concerns are it's unknowable, untestable, unverifiable, it can't be scientific, how do you feel about that and the vital force in terms of homeopathy? Let me just ask. Guys, anybody out there with a view?
By that definition, it is, as Wikipedia says, a pseudoscience. So that's yeah. I'm not sure how we can address that, but I guess that's what we're talking about. Is that what you're saying, Joe?
How can you make?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and we should rise to that challenge.
How can you say it's untestable though? If we've got something where we, from our perspective as a homeopath, put a remedy in, a medicine in, or something that's dynamic, and you get a response, that's certainly a way of communicating with or testing.
That's excellent, Susan. Okay, that's a great start. Keep going. Anybody else?
It's a totally responsive system.
Yeah. Yep. I think you're on exactly the right track. So, I remember way back, and you'll see. So tell me, is there any other thing in modern science whose actual existence is unknowable? See, Hahnemann tells us that the vital
other than
force,
gravity?
right. That's excellent. Thank you.
Like,
Keep going.
so many things. I mean, but there's so many things. The only way that we see them is by the influence, or the not even the mirror, because it doesn't always reflect back. You know, so the wind, I mean, we can measure it and we see the influences. And I was just out here in Minnesota, you know, but and you know, gravity again. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that are part of that mysterious, mystical kinds of things.
But it's really not so mysterious and mystical. What about Jeff? You were going to say something.
No, I totally agree with Sue that that the proof is in the pudding, and that we just need to document according to, and this is the rub, is that we've got to do it according to, you know, the rules of quote-unquote science, and they don't really apply directly to us, except, as Sue indicated, you know, in the individual basis, you know, that they get better.
Why do we have to necessarily, particularly as the new order is unfolding almost as we speak, why do we have to necessarily bow to, or whatever, that old limiting yardstick? And I mean, we've talked about this, Jeff and other people on the call, I know we have, is what is it about our collective pathology that suggests that we need to measure with a yardstick that's being imposed upon us by somebody else, so that we're being reactive instead of proactive. And we can certainly speak in scientific language to have conversation with our colleagues who don't practice homeopathy, but I think it's very dangerous, which is the word that comes quickly and perhaps accurately, to limit our perception of the world and our being in the world and our interacting in the world with that narrow view, you know, not yardstick, that flat earth yardstick, if you will.
Exactly. I think, as we're going to see, we don't know what, you know, I recall what Andre said to me, not me, but the class long ago. He said, look, we don't know what gravity is. We don't know what electricity is. We have no idea. We don't know what life is. We can only discuss it in terms of its manifestations that are visible and how predictable or not predictable that might be. And Hahnemann understood that. So I just wanted to point that out. So that, and even this author says that criticism of vitalism doesn't really have any historical credibility. Really, vitalism got blown away as a political maneuver with the rise in success of mechanistic viewpoints. We also have to understand that vitalism promotes a view of holism, whereas from the mid-1800s onward, there was this great energetic thrust in mechanistic approach or rationalistic approach to chemistry, physics, medicine, to break things down into specialist categories. Whereas vitalism necessarily demands a study of holism. Thank you so much. Both wonderful answers. So, enlightenment, the triumph of reason, synonymous with the age of reason, had as its watchword, sapere aude, which we know from Hahnemann was written on his school, right? Dare to know. Associated with a spirit of rational inquiry was a notion of individual and social perfectibility. So a kind of, social ethos. All questions properly framed could through judicious and careful reasoning be answered. Questions defying knowable answers were seen as illegitimate. They were not really questions, like, what is life? And thus the very essence of the vitalistic discourse. Now, here's a picture of Schelling. We'll learn about him in a moment. According to the German philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, 1775 to 1854. So as you see, Schelling was pretty much cotemporal with Hahnemann, who was 1755 to 1843. For him, the fundamental category of nature philosophy is that of organism. So he saw all of existence, the universe, in the metaphor of an organism. And to him, this is how science should work, through this metaphor. Schelling was somebody of incredible influence, both in the German Romantic movement, the movement that really fostered this kind of holism that incubated Hahnemann, and even today, many great philosophers have said that no one has influenced the Western mind as much as Schelling. Very important. Cotemporal with Hahnemann. 1798. Schelling explicitly revived the Stoic, the ancient philosophy, the Stoic doctrine of a single soul pervading all of nature. And his vision could be described as a vitalistic monism. He was only the most outspoken romantic, seeing a kind of pantheistic vitalism as the answer to the perennial question, what is life? Then we have this school of vitalistic philosophy and medicine. In essence, the Montpellier school, I'm using the English rather than the French pronunciation. In essence, the Montpellier school believed life was unique, individual, and irreducible. This is echoed in the thought of the anti-Enlightenment Johann Georg Hamann, described as drawing a kind of Bergsonian conclusion, namely there is a flow of life, and the attempt to cut this flow kills it. This is a stark contrast to the development of the Paris Clinic. The Paris Clinic is the development of the clinic in medicine was huge, and it sought to create these specialties. A rationalized gaze to shape patients as universally similar. It broke down the body into discrete organ systems, each requiring their own specialist understanding, and drew broad analogies as to the course of disease through the use of statistics and the nihilistic study of large numbers of docile bodies. So we have this in the time around Hahnemann. We have this contrasting historical movement, one towards specialties and mechanism, and the other towards vitalism and looking at the organic whole. It's fascinating. Okay, I want to move along because we've got to get to Hahnemann. The ancients believing two opposites. This is important for Hahnemann's writing, so please take note. The ancients believing two opposites, like soul and body, can only be joined by a specific milieu. Imagine this milieu in several different ways. Platonists called it spirit. Peripatetics, a form. Peripatetics were Aristotelian. Pythagoras and others conceived of harmonies or temperaments, making the body susceptible to feeling and activity. So the idea here is, on the one hand, you have some material thing like the body. On the other hand, something less material like the soul. You need a medium for them to interact. According to Stoics, this principle was fire, an ethereal element. Okay? And then there were other ideas, there were the humors, all of this. So the vitality, according to these vitalists, is affected by irritants. It can rise, it can fall. It's modified by our affections and passions. It's impacted by everything that touches the senses. So anything which touches the senses can affect the vitality. The vitality in history has been called many, many things. Here are a few ideas. Okay? But the idea here is the vitality can be affected by anything which affects the senses. Weather, temperature, pressure, time of day, circumstance, what would later be called modalities. We can see here in early vitalistic thought. The next little bit that I wanted to impart was this, that one of the premises of vitalism was that one of the definite aspects, properties of life, was individuation, that life tended towards individuation. And I have these two quotes just along that vein. So here are all the controversies and a very crude, forgive me, incomplete precursor to vitalism. But Hahnemann's vitalism wasn't just stock vitalism. In fact, there was no stock vitalism. It varied with everybody. The only idea that they had in common was that, look, something that's alive is different from something that's dead. Therefore, maybe we should begin there. Whereas the mechanists said, no, it's all about machine parts. It's got to be all about machine parts. And you guys are not allowed to throw us back into that era where Descartes was afraid of the church. That, I think, is a large part of the residual psychology. So now I want to talk about Richard Hale. For those of you who have read Hale's 2-volume biography of Hahnemann, for those of you who haven't, rather, I read it many, many years ago when I was very green in all of this. I'm reading it again now because I realized, thanks to friends like George Demetriadis, who reviewed my lectures on the organon, he said, Joe, you've made mistakes. You've made mistakes because if you look at Richard Hale, you'll see the correct information. And so I started to review it. And yeah, my memory of having read Richard Hale 20 years ago was way off. But when I reread him now, I just have this incredible admiration for the precision of the man. So I would like to advertise reading again, for any of you who haven't, Richard Hale's Samuel Hahnemann, his life and work in 2 volumes. It's amazing. And the more you've studied homeopathy, the more you'll appreciate the level of effort this man put out. Okay, enough of that. So in chapter 22 in Hale, Hale starts to talk about the concept of vitality. And he says, after Stahl is somebody else. Again, I don't know if he was part of the Montpellier group or not, but he was one of the sources of vitalism in Hahnemann's time. So after Stahl's idea of animism, there followed the so-called vitalism. Vitalism was more midway between the schools as opposed to being extreme. It is influenced throughout by Stahl's theories and animated by the spirit of Hippocrates. It took its origin from the medical school in Montpellier. Its main representatives were the Frenchmen, De Sauvage, Bourdieu, Barthez, Pinel, and in Germany, particularly Ryle. Vitalism teaches that the final basis of all processes in the organism is the vital principle. Its nature is unknown and unfathomable, still as Hahnemann says. It has its seat in the brain and the solar plexus. Nerves transmit to every organ the function corresponding to its structure. It's different from the thinking mind, but is endowed with motion and sensibility. You'll see part of this reflected in the organon. It has the power to maintain form, expansion, situation, tension in all bodily parts and to restore the life and power, and is expressed by disturbances. Illness is an affection and expressed by disturbances in the movement, sensibility, etc. If we are to understand Hahnemann's theory about ideas and about the vital force, we should put him in the setting of his time with the opinions then prevalent. We must regard him as a child of his times. Now look at this. Ryle's work, one of the Montpellier group, he published a dissertation on the life force, which appeared in 1796. And in 1795, I'm skipping a little, in 1795, Hufeland wrote. Now, Hufeland was the publisher of his journal, Hufeland's journal, which was like the New England Journal of Medicine of his time. Hufeland wrote ideas about pathogeny and the influence of the life force on the origin and form of disease. In another place, Huboter tells us vitalism had acquired a prevalence in Germany lasting for decades under Hufeland's influence. So even Hufeland was strongly vitalistic. Okay? But in counterpoint again, that he, referring to Hahnemann, should nevertheless meet with rejection and contradiction on every hand is to be explained by the reason of the fact that he drew from fundamental opinions different conclusions from the others. This shows what a clear thinker, keen observer, independent thinker he was. Now, it's also important to know that Hahnemann did not introduce vitalistic ideas into his system until the 5th edition of the Organon, his second last. And in fact, in several places, he spoke rather disparagingly about the vital force prior to this. This was the product of long thought of Hahnemann. Okay? I'm going to skip this next part. We are running short.
Before you go, it's Susan again, and I know our time's short, but was Hahnemann not also writing very much like Descartes and contemporaries to kind of walk that knife edge or minefield between, the interpretation of the churchy interpretation and that sort of stuff to kind of avoid some of those potential issues of the time?
No, he was well beyond that.
He was well. I mean, he wasn't going to get. No, he wasn't going to get burned at the stake, but there was certainly large church pressure at that time as well about talking about those things.
Not nearly as significant. No.
Okay.
No. It was fairly much a time of free enunciation of thought relative to Descartes, who was on the cusp of the influence. Absolutely no comparison to the level of pressure in Descartes' time compared to Hahnemann's time. Yeah. So I'm going to skip on because I think I've been too slow in all of this. So I'm going to go on. So in the Organon, Hahnemann does not bring up the issue of the vital force until Aphorism 9. And guys, by Aphorism 9, most of the core philosophy of homeopathy has been enunciated. It's really fascinating. Hahnemann, in Aphorism 9, gives us what I still say is the most beautiful definition of health that I have ever heard. So I'm going to go through it because I think it's way important than the other stuff. If anybody wants this document, you're all more than welcome to have it. But here's Aphorism 9. In the healthy condition of man, this is his definition of health. The spiritual vital force, autocracy, the dynamis that animates the material body, organism, rules with unbounded sway and retains all the parts of the organism in admirable, harmonious, vital operation as regards sensation and function, so that our indwelling, reason-gifted mind can freely employ this living, healthy instrument for the higher purposes of existence. Now, I want to go through this a bit, as I do in my lectures, but this is so gorgeous. And I'm sure that even though I'm going to explain some stuff to you, I've missed a lot. In the healthy condition of man, so he's defining health, the spiritual vital force. Now, when he says spiritual, he does not mean that which is metaphysical. He means that which is invisible and acts in doing work, therefore a force. In the healthy condition of man, the spiritual vital force, the dynamis, the force that animates the material body. So imagine a marionette being brought to life, Pinocchio being brought to life. This autocracy, this vital force, rules with unbounded sway and retains all the billions of cells, the different systems, both tissue and hormonal and nervous and everything else, in an admirable, mind-bogglingly beautiful, harmonious, vital operation, as regards and as evidenced by feeling and function, sensation and function. You will see that sensation and function become the cornerstone of homeopathy. So that our indwelling, reason-gifted mind can freely employ this living, healthy instrument, the body, for the higher purposes of existence. So our indwelling, reason-gifted mind, you'll see, as was evidenced before in what I said about vitalism, different from the reasoning mind, and still in concert with really Descartes' division of God giving this reason-gifted mind and putting it in the body. So he wasn't totally against that definition, or he wouldn't have used it here. The material organism, this is Aphorism 10 now. Oh, I'm sorry. So that the mind can freely employ this living, healthy instrument for the higher purposes of our existence. What are those higher purposes? He did not say in the Organon, but if you look in the introduction to chronic diseases, he talks about the higher purposes of our existence as simply being that we should, while we're alive, improve ourselves as much as possible and improve the lives of those around us as much as possible. That's the higher purpose he was referring to. Aphorism 10. The material organism without the vital force is capable of no sensation, no function, no self-preservation. So he's saying here that vitality gives us feeling or sensation and function, and gives us the ability to have an immune system, to self-preserve. Okay? When you're dead, you then become subject to the laws of nature and entropy, and you just get resolved into your chemical constituents. I thought, when I teach, I love this poem by Emily Dickinson that really makes alive for me this concept of what is the vitality. So imagine Emily Dickinson, or imagine yourself in a graveyard, just looking around, referring to the dust in the tombs, in the vaults. Here's Emily Dickinson. This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies and lads and girls, was laughter and ability and sighing, and frocks and curls. This passive place, a summer's nimble mansion, where bloom and bees fulfilled their oriental circuit, then ceased like these. To me, that's the difference between life and death, and what the vital force could do in animating dust. Jeff, how much time have I got?
As much as you need. We've got at least another half hour.
Good. Now, to me, the whole linchpin of all of this is this wild and crazy Aphorism 11. Aphorism 11 is present in its first paragraph in the 5th edition. And that's the first time it was in there, never before the 5th edition. In the 6th edition, Hahnemann adds this totally wild and crazy footnote that I think we've got to go through. So, and again, to preserve time, I'm going to whip through it, hopefully hitting the high spots. But then I'm going to stop, and we've got to talk before I go on. So here it is. When a person falls ill, it is only this spiritual, automatic vital force. Because the vital force is not intelligent, it is instinctive, automatic. Everywhere present in the organism. And so, when you fall ill, all of you is ill. That is primarily deranged by the dynamic influence upon it of a morbific agent inimical to life. He's saying it's not the poisonous aspect that really makes you truly sick, although that can make you sick, there's no question, but only this energetic aspect that really makes you sick. It is only the vital force deranged to such an abnormal state that it can furnish the organism with disagreeable sensations and incline it to irregular processes which we call disease. So, that last sentence, disagreeable sensation, irregular processes, so altered feeling and function that we call disease. For as a power invisible in itself and only cognizable by its effects on the organism, its morbid derangement only makes itself known by manifestation of disease in sensation and function. Again, feeling and function of those parts, feeling and function with a specific geography, exposed to the senses of the observer and physician, that is by morbid symptoms, and in no other way can it make itself known. So just like any form of energy, just like gravity, just like electricity, you can't know what energy is except by its ability to make itself visible. You know, because of Schelling is also credited with helping Freud later on in time, of course, circa 1900, come up with the idea of the unconscious. The unconscious is just a way to get around a vital force. Jung's concept of a psyche and his division of the psyche into multiple aspects is all about a division of the functions of energy. It's all about talking about a vital force. And hence, even Jung, even Freud, are criticized and put aside as not being scientific. Now, Hahnemann is saying in Aphorism 11, we only know that an organism is sick by morbid symptoms, by alteration of feeling and function. And that it happens by means of a vital force, as we've described. So here he says, well, what is a dynamic influence? Now we're into the footnote. This footnote that is absolutely unique to the sixth edition, the sixth and final edition of the Organon. And as we'll see, contains some pretty wow surprises. What is a dynamic influence? Our Earth, by virtue of a hidden invisible energy, carries the moon around her in 28 days and several hours, and the moon alternately in definite fixed hours, raises our northern seas to flood tide, and again correspondingly lowers them to ebb. Apparently this takes place not through material agencies, not through mechanical contrivances, as are used for the products of human labor. There's no cranes, there's no bulldozers. And so we see numerous other events about us as results of the action of one substance on another substance without being able to recognize a sensible connection between cause and effect. Only the cultured, and this is so important, watch these words, only the cultured, practiced in comparison and deductions, can form for himself a kind of supersensible idea sufficient to keep all that is material or mechanical in his thoughts from such concepts. He calls such concepts dynamic or virtual. Okay? So later on, we'll see that one of the examples of this dynamic or virtual action is not just the effect of the moon on tides, but also the effect of magnets on iron filings. And he equates this as well to the sick making we're here right now. For instance, the dynamic effect of sick making influences upon a healthy man, as well as the dynamic energy of medicines on the principle of life and the restoration of health. It's nothing more than an infection. And later on, I'll talk about Hahnemann's concept of infection. Is nothing else than infection. And so not in any way material, not in any way mechanical. Just as the energy of a magnet attracting a piece of iron is not material, not mechanical. One sees the piece of iron is attracted by one pole of the magnet, but how it's done is not seen. This invisible energy of the magnet does not require a hook or a lever. The magnet draws to itself and acts upon the piece of iron or steel needle by means of a purely immaterial conceptual energy, that is dynamically, and communicates to the steel needle the magnetic energy equally, invisibly, or dynamically. The steel needle becomes itself magnetic, even at a distance, when the magnet does not touch it, and magnetizes other needles with the same magnetic property with which it had been endowed previously by the magnetic rod. And here's the kicker. Just as a child with smallpox or measles communicates to a near untouched healthy child in an invisible manner, smallpox or measles, that is, infects at a distance without anything material from the infective child going or capable of going to the one to be infected. A purely specific conceptual influence communicated to the near child, smallpox or measles, in the same way as a magnet communicated to the near needle the magnetic property. Now that has got to make you say, come on, Sam, you're full of it. We know that there is something communicated. We know that there's a bug that is communicated that infects. So why is Sam not with the program? Well, first of all, this is even before Pasteur. But secondly, it's even more mysterious than that. This addition to the organon, nothing material transmitted, is his last word, 6th edition, 1843. Let's take a little look back in history. In 1831, in the cholera, his article 1831 on the cholera epidemic, listen to this. On board ships, in those confined spaces, filled with moldy water vapors, the cholera miasm. And I have to tell you, George Demetriadis pretty equivocally tells us that when you hear a term miasm, cholera miasm, it refers to the infectious organism. Miasmatic disease refers to the disease, but miasm refers to the infectious organism. Okay. The cholera miasm finds a favorable element for its multiplication and grows into an enormously increased brood of those excessively minute and visible living creatures so inimical to human life, of which contagious matter of cholera most probably consists. So a whole bunch of microorganisms in a place ripe for their multiplication. The cause is composed of probably millions of those animated beings, which at first developed on the marshy banks of the tepid Ganges, searching out in preference the human being to his destruction, and attaching themselves closely to him. This is 1831. He goes on. Above all other drugs, camphor possesses the property of speedily killing by its vapor the most minute animals of a low order. So it's antibiotic, or perhaps consequently, it will be able to kill most speedily and annihilate the cholera miasm, which most probably consists of a murderous organism undetected to our senses, which attaches itself to a man's skin, hair, etc. Okay? And in this way, liberate and recover the sufferer from it and from the disease. So here something has clearly been transmitted. Now, if we go to Hahnemann's chronic diseases, which I will not torment you with, Hahnemann says that psora is transmitted in the lymph or the fluid contained within the vesicles of the itching psoric itch vesicle. So something material. But at the end of his life, in the 6th edition, he says, no, nothing visible. It's all energetic. So he hasn't ignored the rudiments of what we perceive to be this contagious model. He's saying, no, it's wrong. That it is predominantly some kind of energetic transference primarily. And that the energetic transference operates at this level of the vital force. It's fascinating. Let's go on. So here's George Demetriadis from his pamphlet on chronic diseases, which again, I would really say is a fantastic read if you have any interest in miasms. George did an incredible review of Hahnemann's chronic disease, making it much more understandable. But here, he's basically saying that for him, an infection is the situation where something extrinsic to the organism can arouse within the organism a particular reaction. That's all. It doesn't necessarily imply a microorganism. It could be any extrinsic force which could arouse within the system a particular reaction. But I really recommend you read this little blurb, which is a quotation from George Demetriadis's pamphlet on chronic diseases. But I'm going to move on. Okay? Good. Aphorism 16. Our vital force as a spirit-like dynamis cannot be attacked and affected by injurious influences on the healthy organism caused by external inimical forces that disturb the harmonious play of life, otherwise than in a spirit-like dynamic way. And in the like manner, all morbid derangements cannot be removed from it by the physician in any other way than a spirit-like alterative powers of the serviceable medicines acting on our spirit-like force, which perceives them through the medium of the nerves, everywhere present in the organism. See, when I first read this, I said, come on, Sam, you're full of it. Are you telling me if I get hit by a truck that this only affects me on a dynamic or invisible plane? Of course not. It can't. He cannot be referring to that completely. If you're injured, if you're poisoned, if any of the external necessities of life are deprived, then the material system, the organism, that requires certain fundamentals to support the action of the dynamic plane is deprived of those, and of course it will fail. He's talking about something different. He's saying here, disease in any patterned way must occur at the level of the vital force. This is a very important thing. So, you know, I want to go back to Aphorism 11. In the footnote to Aphorism 11, the very beginning, he says, let me just find it. Okay. Only the cultured, practiced in comparison and deduction, can inform for himself a kind of supersensual idea. What does he mean by that? Does he mean to say that all of us are ignorant and stupid if we can't see this? Well, maybe. But what about this? The time is 1843. Hahnemann has been playing since about 1811, 1814. He's been playing with the idea of diminishing the dose. Then, suddenly around 1814, with the idea, or 1811 in there, my dates are poor, with suddenly dilution becomes dynamization. He's been playing with the idea of provings. Hahnemann, by now, by 1843, has had a large career, both in the creation of disease symptoms in provings, with the 30C potency, or with potencies in general, and curing them curing these disease syndromes in people with a 30C, both of which he would consider to be immaterial. He's had a huge history of the creation of disease symptoms with immaterial doses in approving, the cure in real disease based on that data of disease symptoms. He is saying that anything which is patterned, and especially in chronic diseases where not only do we have the introduction of a new pattern, but a pattern which can self-generate to larger and larger extents, getting worse from year to year. All of this occurring at a level beyond the material. So his doctrine of dynamization is saying that the more he dilutes and potentizes, the more he's affecting this invisible level. Something beyond the material. And that's the importance of this footnote to Aphorism 11. So let's skip ahead again and say, so what can we say about the vital force so far? It's invisible, but also inseparable. A lot of the vitalists before said that the vital element was separable. Some of them even said it was weighable. Hahnemann says no, it's part and parcel of the material being. We can talk about it as if it were separable, only because we need to think in a linear way. But in fact, you cannot conceive of it as other than an artifact of the living being, both material and dynamic. It's the vital force which gives us our ability to have sensation and function. Without the vital force, we'd also have no defense, and we'd just fall into a few bucks worth of chemicals. The vital force, or that level of vitality, is also the level at which things may be patterned in health and disease. So if you're dramatically affected by some dynamic influence of a stressor or an illness, the danger is that it will imprint itself at this level, causing a new pattern to be ingrained in the system which operates in disease. And isn't this the huge difference between allopathy and homeopathy? In allopathy, they take for granted that if you have a tendency towards arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, nothing on God's green earth is going to stop that, but they will suppress it with anti-inflammatories or biologics to whatever detriment of the organism, just to stop that progress, because by definition, they feel they cannot stop the motivation of the system to operate in the pattern of that arthritis. Well, homeopathy says, well, if you find the simillimum, then over time you can diminish or extinguish the desire of the vital force to operate in that negative pattern. So important. This is a crucial difference between homeopathy and allopathy. In later aphorisms in the Organon, we find that the vital force is extremely resilient and does not like to be suppressed, but you know all about that. The vital force can entertain more than one disease pattern at a time. You could have two dissimilar diseases. You could have a disease on the mental emotional level whose modalities and features are totally different than the disease you experience in the GI system, whose modalities and features are diametrically opposed to the first and require two different remedies. So we can have dissimilar disease. The other feature is that the vital force is always unitary. When you fall ill everywhere. Okay, so we're learning a lot about what the vital force is for Hahnemann, how it might have been different from the vitalism of his predecessors, because for Hahnemann, we have an invisible force whose effects are visible, otherwise it's unknown. And when we apply a remedy at this, whose existence is at the same level, we expect the pattern of symptoms to diminish. Therefore, the criticisms leveled against homeopathy as a vitalism do not apply, because we do have a way of testing it. Now, just because I'm running out of time, Aphorism 288 talks about something that is a huge surprise, even to me, and it was only in the last few years that I really grabbed hold of this, because I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. In Aphorism 288, Hahnemann talks about mesmerism. Now, although most of us equate mesmerism with hypnosis, original mesmerism, even though it did create a sort of a somnambulistic state in some people, was a lot more like Reiki than it was like, or energy work, was like what we perceive as hypnosis. But listen to this. In mesmerism, which Hahnemann lauds as something which is amazing if we have a very effective and well-intentioned individual doing it, it acts in part, this is 288, it acts in part by replacing in the sick whose vital force within the organism is deficient here and there, in part also in other parts where the vital force has accumulated too much and keeps up irritating nervous disorders, it turns aside, diminishes, and distributes it equally, and in general extinguishes the morbid condition of the life principle of the patient and substitutes in its place the normal of the mesmerist acting powerfully upon him. It's almost as if a well-intentioned, skilled mesmerist could affect the vital force which is deficient here and there, or here too much accumulated and there deficient. So again, the mesmerist could transmit deficient energy, give you more, could act as a homeopathic remedy himself if there were deficient energy, or if the geographic distribution of energy were altered. This really blew me away. Then I realized the wording of the organon. If you go back to what a disease is, disease, according to Hahnemann, in aphorisms, the early aphorisms, 10 and 11, 11 especially, is a derangement, a mistunement of the vital force. Homeopathy fixes a disharmonious vital force where it's deranged. However, something like energy work can act where the vitality is either deficient, too much or too little in certain geographical locations. It can even it out, almost like traditional Chinese medicine views deficiency or excess of yin or yang. It's fascinating. So these are two, I think, for Hahnemann, two different features. One is a disharmony, a derangement, a mistunement. The other is excess or deficiency in certain places, which an energy worker can work through. I just thought that distinction would be useful for us clinically. And there's so much more in the organon we haven't even talked about. So the only evidence of the vital force in its derangement is a totality. And I understand that you have one of the great experts in the organon to talk to you about that, Joel Shepard, in upcoming lectures. So I hope we've talked a little, and maybe brought a few ideas up for your consideration in terms of what is the vital force, its antecedents in history, and how it plays out in the organon. And this topic was way too big for one lecture, so I tried to condense this to a few salient points. I'm going to stop right there, and thank you, Jeff. Any questions?
No, thank you, Joe. That was great. Yeah. Yeah, Joel, this ties in wonderfully to Joel's last talk. He said he's in the process of preparing a talk on just this topic and miasms, specifically miasms, for later in the year. So hopefully you'll join us. We'll have a lively discussion. I'm curious, though, would you go into a little bit more about that distinction that you just made between the vital force and mesmerism?
Yeah, to me, it's fascinating. So Hahnemann, in reference to his definition of disease, speaks to a derangement. Depending upon the translation you use, it can say derangement or mistunement of the vital force. So the image that comes to mind is almost of a guitar or an instrument playing with strings that are not appropriately tuned, and when you strum them, it creates a disharmony, a deranged, out of order kind of functioning of the vital force. But here in 288, 289, Hahnemann says that there are situations where there is a deficiency of vitality, or where locally in certain areas there is excess or deficiency of vital energy. And here, a skilled mesmerist might substitute his own vitality and remedy it in that way. But we have two different situations. One is excess and deficiency, and the other is derangement or disharmony. So I'm only asking the question. I'm not making a conclusion. Is it possible that remedies, in Hahnemann's view, corrected this disharmony, almost like retuning a musical instrument? But retuning disharmony is different from excess and deficiency locally in the organism, which might be the purview of an energy worker. And he also gives certain examples of the symptomatic profile that might occur in those aphorisms. So could it be that part of what we need to recognize is differentially is not only is something hygienic or dynamic, but is it also in the realm of deficiency or excess, which might be better approached by a different discipline, say a Reiki worker or an energy worker, or I don't know. But I think that's something we should explore. Hahnemann had great respect for Mesmer. I guess that's about all I have to say on that.
Anyone else? Any other comments? Anthony is still here. Yeah, looks like we've got a full house. So any comments, questions? Look for clarification. Anything at all? All right. Well, I don't see anything, and we're running late, so. Joe, do you have any queries for us? Because we use Mesmer, the desire to be mesmerized rubric all the time. And it's not related to hypnotizing our animals.
So the desire to be mesmerized is almost as if somebody wants to be influenced by someone else, something else. and is waiting for that and responds strongly to that. Yeah. No, that's about all I have to say on this. I think a lot of this is stuff we need to think about and work out for ourselves and maybe have cases around. So many of us, I'm sure, have seen cases where the symptoms were vague, and yet somebody, maybe even doing something more esoteric than what we do, energy workers, Reiki workers, were able to help a situation get healed. So I think we need to look more into that. Hahnemann was fascinated. Hahnemann didn't think that the only game in town at all was homeopathy. Why should we? No.
And we're gonna go. Lori has a question, so let me unmute Lori before I ask. So please, Lori, can you hear us? Lori? Oh, Lori's got her hand raised, but looks up. There she is. Lori?
How would we get a copy of this document?
Oh, I'll gladly email it to Jeff, and you guys can just run with it. Go to the original sources, see what you think, and I would look forward to any feedback because, you know, a lot of this is unknown territory. What do we mean by the vital force? What is this invisible realm that Hahnemann was talking about? And as well, you guys know that something very similar to what we were talking about was written in the alchemical papyruses of Hermes Trismegistus, where they talked about the fact that if you want to get to the spiritual aspect of a substance, you must diminish its material nature by degrees. And remember that some old homeopathic teachers loved to show that papyrus, which was one of the bases of alchemy, saying that every substance had as its true nature, transformative nature, this essence that could transform other things. So basically it was talking about this a prototype of you know, dynamism, of potentization, and of affecting the vital force. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
Okay, great. So lots of thank yous, Joe. So thank you. And is there anything else from anyone else? Yep, looks like we're clear. So Joe, we hope to see you again later in the year. And thank you all for coming, and the recording will be available. Joe will send us the document, and we will go from there. So thank you, Joe, and have a great night. I hear it's a little windy up in Toronto. So
It sure is. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you all for your attention, and just any feedback is always appreciated.
Okay, thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Good night.